Benatar's argument for antinatalism, a primer. David Benatar is known for his argument for antinatalism, the moral view that it's wrong to bring sentient beings into existence. Especially his asymmetry of values garnered a lot of interest, since it's quite unique and complicated. However, most of the time only this part of the argument is presented with little connection to his conclusion. Here I will briefly sketch out how his entire argument proceeds. Outline of the argument. First, Benatar presents four basic uncontroversial asymmetries in our moral attitudes. These are intuitions we would accept upon reflection, and they are about how we would judge hypothetical situations where there are some miserable people versus where there are no joyful people. Next, Benatar asks, why do we have these intuitions? What unites them? He argues that there is a more fundamental asymmetry of values that grounds them. From it, he concludes that it is always a harm to come into existence. Then, he says that all lives are of very poor quality, and that there actually are no good lives. No matter how we measure quality of life, we end up with the same result. Life is, in fact, very bad, much worse than we naively think. Taking these two ideas together, we arrive at the conclusion that coming into existence is always a serious harm, and when we consider the interest of the prospective child, we must conclude that we have a duty not to bring them into existence. The argument for antinatalism. Now we can go into the details, starting with the four basic asymmetries. Benatar identified four basic asymmetries in our moral intuitions. That is, if we reflected on certain cases, we would agree with certain pairs of moral attitudes which do not form strict opposites. Let's go through them. The first one is the prospective beneficence asymmetry. It is strange to cite as a reason for having a child that that child will thereby be benefited. It is not similarly strange to cite as a reason for not having a child that that child will suffer. Here we would find it peculiar if someone said they want to have a child because it would be good for the child to exist. But it is perfectly understandable to hear someone say that they don't want to have a child because the child will suffer, perhaps due to some genetic defect. The next one is the retrospective beneficence asymmetry. When one has brought a suffering child into existence, it makes sense to regret having brought that child into existence and to regret it for the sake of that child. By contrast, when one fails to bring a happy child into existence, one cannot regret that failure for the sake of the person. When a miserable child is born, we naturally pity that child. And we're not simply sad, but we are sad for that child. And if we were the parents, we would regret bringing him into existence. But if it turned out that the child would live a happy life, but we didn't bring him into existence, we cannot be sad about the child not existing. That is, we cannot consider the interests of the child, we cannot be sad on behalf of that potential happy child. Then we have the asymmetry of distant suffering and absent happy people. We are rightly sad for distant people who suffer. By contrast, we need not shed any tears for absent happy people on uninhabited planets, or uninhabited islands, or other regions on our own planet. Say we learn about a faraway land where people were struck by a terrible disease and poverty. We know they suffer greatly. We would feel compassion towards them. Now, let's imagine a different place where there are no people at all. We won't feel any sorrow towards some hypothetical happy people that could have lived there. There is no point in crying over the absence of people there. And finally, the asymmetry of procreational duties. While we have a duty to avoid bringing into existence people who would lead miserable lives, we have no duty to bring into existence those who would lead happy lives. If we learned that our child would be very miserable, we should not bring him into the world. If we learned that our child would be very happy, we simply don't have to bring him into the world. The asymmetry of values. Then Benatar asks, why do we have those intuitions? What unites them? He argues that there is a more fundamental asymmetry of values that grounds them. Benatar presents his axiological asymmetry like so. Whereas the presence of bad and good are perfectly symmetrical, the presence of pain is bad and the presence of pleasure is good, the asymmetry shows up when we consider the absence of these. The absence of pain is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone, but the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is somebody for whom this absence is a deprivation. He then constructs a table with comparisons to further analyze it. In the table, we have scenario A on the left side, which is about already existing people like you and me. Here, presence of harm is bad, feeling pain is worse than not being in pain, and the presence of benefit is good, having a benefit is better than not having it. On the right side we have scenario B, and here we are considering a potential future child, one that could have been conceived. For this person, who never was, absence of harm is good. It's better for him not to exist rather than to exist and suffer. In other words, harm would be bad for him had he existed. So we are evaluating this case by thinking of the non-existing person in a hypothetical manner. What if he existed? And finally, the absence of benefit is simply not bad. This person does not exist, so he is not missing out on any pleasures or goods. Here we are evaluating this case by pointing to the obvious, which is that there is no person X who could be worse off. These comparisons are employed to argue that existence has no advantages over non-existence, but non-existence has advantages over existence, and from that, coming into existence is always a harm. Quality of life. So far, we've established that coming into existence is always a harm, but we don't yet know how severe of a harm it is. Our lives are really bad. There might be many methods of answering the question just how bad our lives really are. If we want to be objective, unbiased, we cannot rely on our self-reports. We need to approach this question methodically. Hedonistic approach. We can look at the extent of broadly construed pleasure and pain in life. In particular, we're looking at positive states such as pleasurable smells, joy, love, listening to music, and many others. But we're also looking at negative feelings, such as discomfort, guilt, irritation, boredom, loneliness, etc. Each day is full of smaller discomforts, such as hunger, being too cold or too hot, itching, tired muscles, and so on. If we look closely at our normal days, we find that such negative feelings accompany us very frequently. We just don't think about them anymore. We're used to be like that. What's more, a normal life is characterized by illness, chronic pains, depression, high stress, exhaustion, and a whole slew of things that go wrong when we get old. What about the pleasures? Whatever they would be, because of the fundamental asymmetries of value, they don't make life comparatively better than never existing. Desire fulfillment approach. We can look at the extent to which our desires are fulfilled. Very often, what we desire is merely for bad things to go away. But because, as we have just seen, negative states are so prevalent, our desires to be free from them are also constantly being thwarted. In any case, whatever desire we examine, we are faced with a brute fact that a desire lasts for quite some time before it is satisfied, if it is satisfied at all. Some of our desires may last for days, months, or even long years, and during that time they are being frustrated. What's worse, even after attaining what we needed, satisfaction cannot last forever. Sooner or later, the object of our desire leaves us. If that wasn't enough, fulfilling our desires requires work. We must strive, do stuff, pass challenges, and so on, to even have a chance of attaining what we want. Otherwise, we would be constantly frustrated. Doing nothing quickly descends into pain. Objective list approach. We can also look at life according to some objective criteria. Here, we also consider pleasure and pain and fulfilled and thwarted desires, but go further than that. We take into account things like freedom, accomplishments, meaning, friendships, creativity, virtues, knowledge, and many others. If we bracketed our human constraints, we would see that our lives are very short, have no ultimate meaning, cannot be free from suffering, and we are very narrow in understanding, etc. An evocative analogy can be construed to convey a way to think about such objective goods. We can look at beings who we know are limited in certain aspects. Take a grasshopper, for example. Compared to ours, his life lacks many important goods, and he doesn't even recognize what he's missing. In the analogy, we're all like that grasshopper, and there is a higher perspective from which our lives are severely limited and lacking in important goods. Why don't we see how bad our lives really are? Most people don't see their lives as so horrible. On the contrary, they think of their lives as being pretty good. How could this be when we've seen that our lives are, indeed, bad on all accounts? It is because of various psychological mechanisms which bias our assessment towards the good things and make us ignore the bad things. Optimism bias. One such mechanism is the optimism bias. It's easier for us to recall positive experiences. This itself severely distorts our judgment, and it applies to the past as well as to our expectations of the future. We are similarly biased to think of our own lives as better than the lives of other people, and many considerations such as our health, economic status, education, etc. don't affect this optimistic assessment that much. Adaptation. The next psychological mechanism is adaptation. We simply get used to the life we have. Even if a calamity strikes us, after some time we learn to live with it. So we don't pay that much attention to our objectively worse condition. Comparison with others. Yet another distorting factor is that we unintentionally compare our lives to the lives of other people. When we see people who have it even worse than us, we tend to think of our lives as being actually pretty good, even though they aren't. Also, comparing ourselves to others makes us ignore all the bad features of lives that are common to all or most people. The oomph. An evocative metaphor to convey how the parts of the argument work together is to imagine you want to drive a car. First, you have to know where you are, what is your starting point. It's the 4 basic asymmetries. The engine moves everything forward. This is the fundamental asymmetry of values. The fuel gives power. This is the quality of life argument. And there you go. you arrive at the destination, the antinatalist conclusion that we have a duty not to bring sentient beings into existence. Additional remarks. With the argument for antinatalism laid out, I'd like to raise a couple of additional topics that are closely associated in Benatar's thought. Life worth continuing versus life worth starting. There is some ambiguity with respect to the term life worth living. In one sense, we're talking about an already existing person for whom life is worth continuing or not. In another sense, we're thinking about a potential person who could exist in the future, and we're wondering whether it would be worth starting such a life. The problem Benatar identified is that people often confuse these two and think of future people as if they already existed. They say that it's worth to bring someone into existence because life is worth continuing in general. But just because someone's life is worth continuing doesn't follow that it was worth starting. It's because it takes a lot more to make a life not worth continuing, but the threshold should be much lower for starting a life. For example, losing a hand in an accident is not enough to make a life not worth continuing. But most people would object to bringing into existence someone with no hand. Death. Benatar explains that the view that coming into existence is always a harm does not warrant one to simply conclude that ceasing to exist, for example through suicide, is always the right thing to do. Simply put, life may not be bad enough to end it. Because we have interests in our lives, it is usually worth to continue to live as death deprives us of future goods we could experience. We have some intuitions that support the view that death is, in fact, bad. Namely, that murdering someone severely harms him and that it's usually better to live longer. What's more, inevitable death is yet another reason why coming into existence is a harm. There's one more point that's important to note. Benatar argued that our lives are of very poor quality. We could be pushed to infer that because of our lives being really bad, death would, in fact, be preferable. Here, we should allow people to make the mistake of overvaluing their lives to respect their autonomy. This shouldn't be a big deal since they're not making decisions about bringing another person into existence. Abortion. Benatar believes that coming into existence in the morally relevant sense is not a point in time, but a process. Still, even though there is no sharp line, we can speak of a time before and after one has come into existence. When a child has already come into existence with some basic interests, we should not abort him as this premature death would be a harm to him. But when the fetus has not yet developed interests and is in the early stages of development, then we should abort him to spare him from existing. This is Benatar's pro-death position with regard to abortion. Animals and other beings. Benatar is very clear when it comes to considerations regarding beings other than humans. He says that his argumentation applies to animals and even to hypothetical conscious machines. For him, it is always a harm to come into existence, and therefore it is wrong to inflict this harm. We shouldn't therefore create sentient AI, create artificial life, or force or aid in reproduction of animals. Extinction. Benatar says that we cannot regret humanity going extinct, but the sooner humans and other animals go extinct, the better. What we can regret, however, is the particular way the species disappears, as that may involve a lot of killing and a lot of suffering. For him, the best hypothetical path, under very specific conditions, would be a gradual decreasing of population towards zero, such that the quality of life of existing people would not fall significantly. But he is still against forcing people not to have children, even more so if instituted by a government, as that undermines some of the prime values we hold: autonomy and freedom. Summary. Another way to briefly convey how the argument proceeds through the steps is by backtracking. We start with the conclusion that we have a duty not to bring sentient beings into existence. But why is that? It's because coming into existence is a serious harm. But why is it serious? Because quality of all our lives is objectively very bad. But is it always a harm? Yes, because existence has no advantages over existence, while non-existence does have advantages over existence. Why do you say that? This is because never existing spares us from all suffering, and there is no one to miss out on the goods. And this is the best explanation of our moral intuitions from the four basic asymmetries. And this is the place not needing inferences in the argument. It is the observable empirical given, our starting point. And that's it. That's Benatar's argument for antinatalism.